Okay, as I said in the first video, my theory is not one that is probably a big deal. You're not going to hear it and go, wow, that's the best Memento theory I've ever heard. If you know anything about theories. Now, I want to say Memento theories in particular. I'm assuming there are tons of Memento theories. I don't really know. I'm not above going to the forums and reading about them. I just think it would take some of the joy of the self-discovery, to spend time with the film yourself and getting to know it. So that's one of the reasons why I don't go to the forums to get ideas. This is going to be a long one probably, so I thought this would be good if you're doing dishes or something, or have some time to spare. Put this off to the side and listen. I will warn you though, if you don't find Memento to be too good of a movie, or you've never gotten too deep in the weeds on this, this might not be the most enjoyable thing. I hope so. Also, major spoilers, obviously. But so I'm presenting a theory and then a bonus theory, and then do my best to recall as much of this information as I can without being all over the place. The theory that I have, again, it's the argument to the theory I think we'll find most interesting, is over the years when I've talked about Memento to people, I've suggested it and they've watched it, people accept the basic idea that Leonard has short-term memory loss. But someone will eventually say, well, maybe Leonard's faking. I will eventually hear that. Maybe Leonard was faking. And that's legitimate. I think that's worth thinking about. But I think something's going on in their subconscious that is starting to make them consider that. Okay, something's making them think that maybe Leonard's faking. And there actually is a third option. And the third option comes about by trying to understand who Sammy Jankus was and the conflation between Leonard's identity and Sammy Jankus's identity. And that may, if we go real hard towards Leonard's identity being Sammy Jankus's identity as described in the movie, then the theory that would emerge is that Leonard's condition is perhaps actually psychological, not physical. So we see in the scene in the bathroom, Leonard's, head gets hit against the mirror, which, knowing Nolan and his history and literature, that means, shattered identity, and then falls on the floor and you see blood running out, would give the impression that it's a physical condition. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, one of the reasons why I think people have this sort of tacit way of believing that Leonard might be faking is that it would seem awfully odd that this guy, Sammy Jenkins, has this condition, and then all of a sudden, Leonard gets the condition. That's a little weird. He even says in the movie that the condition is real, it's just very rare. And Sammy had it, then Leonard has it. Now, Leonard deals with insurance claims, health insurance apparently, deals with in the fraud department, and it may have been more likely that he would come across this, but what's the chances he also gets this? Unless, in Memento, it talks about, I forget which scene, it talks about planting a seed. I don't think that it was talking directly about this that I'm talking about, but maybe it's a little bit of a hint that Sammy's fakery planted a seed in Leonard. And when Leonard saw his wife die, he contracted what we today would probably call PTSD, right? And arrived at this psychological position. It's kind of interesting. So on the surface, that Leonard's condition is psychological rather than physical doesn't sound all too interesting. But it explains some things that I think are interesting. Okay, I also have a bonus theory. My bonus theory, a little bit harder, neither of these will be fully rock solidly substantiated by Christopher Nolan's intention. You won't be able to arrive at a ultimate conclusion on this. She won't go into the movie, get done, and say, Travis was right, this is exactly what's happening. Which is what I love about this film. There's some hard conclusions, and then there's some others that are left open. The bonus theory is that the title of the movie, Memento, might be talking about a specific memento. And I was thinking about that this last time I watched it yesterday. Again, even harder to substantiate than Leonard's psychological condition, but interesting nonetheless. Now, Leonard goes to Bert. In case you don't know, Bert is the guy at the front office at the discount inn. And some really interesting foreshadowing going on here. Leonard's talking to him, and Bert's giving him this look like he's acting strange. And Leonard says, we've talked before. And he's like, yeah, man, it's weird. We've talked a bunch of times. You don't remember? And he's like, no. And then as Bert's talking, Leonard fakes like he remembers something Bert says. And Bert calls him out on it. I don't remember exactly how that goes down. You have to watch it yourself, but it's there. Now, why is that important? Well, when he talks about Sammy Jenkins, he says he thought Sammy Jenkins was faking. He says, but you learned to fake it, to get a pat on the head from the doctor or whatever. Additionally, another really interesting thing that is revealed too is he says that when you have this condition, nobody believes you. And so I do think Nolan wants us to be a little bit suspicious of Leonard. He didn't believe Sammy Jenkins. And in fact, there's just this theme in the movie of Leonard is always being tested. You see Sammy Jenkins being tested. Leonard was probably actually tested, not Sammy Jenkins. Although Sammy Jenkins may also have been tested. But, and that's how they figured out he was a fake. The electrified objects he kept picking up because he was faking. Not realizing that the insurance could say, oh, this condition is not physical, it's psychological. He should be physically capable of making new memories. Leonard probably also was tested. Where's some other areas where Leonard is tested? Well, he's tested, I think, by Jimmy Grant's. Now, how's this the case? Jimmy Grant's, I can't prove this, might possibly be the owner of the discount inn. Bert tells, and that might be going a little far, I'm not sure, but Bert tells Leonard, well, see how many rooms you can rent this guy. That his boss told him to do that. And we learn later on from Joe Pantoliano's character, Teddy, that Bert helps Jimmy Grant's deal drugs out of the discount inn. So when you're picturing all this and putting it all together, there's a connection between the bar that Natalie works out and the inn where Grant's does business, okay? So when the scenes are in black and white, Leonard is in room 21, and when the scenes are in color, Leonard's in room 304. So he's been renting multiple rooms, and it may be possible this happened at the behest of Jimmy Grant's. But anyway, whatever the case, Leonard was being tested. Where's another place that Leonard's tested? Well, Natalie tests him, right? She finds out he has this. She's suspicious, of it. And she spits in his drink, gets the guy at the bar, spits in his drink, gets him to spit in his own drink to test him. That this confirms what Leonard says. When you have this condition, nobody believes you. He says, I didn't even believe Sammy. So he's implying here that being trusted, okay, is an uphill battle. Now, I don't know why this was done other than to maybe give the audience, I'm speculating here, okay? All this is speculation, but this is big speculation. I think all this is to give the audience a bit of a phony redemption arc. It's this idea to make the audience think, that Leonard should be trusted when obviously Leonard should not be trusted. He's an unreliable narrator. So there's also the function of having him in two different rooms was also there so that the audience it planted a seed in the audience's mind that people might be screwing with this guy. Everything's positioning to get you to think about everyone else being the problem other than Leonard. Great stuff. Really, really good stuff. Um, I want to talk briefly about the timeline so that we can get to the identity of Sammy Jenkins. Now, Leonard is conditioning himself. What do you see? He looks at his hand and says, "Remember Sammy Jenkins." What's he doing there? The first thing he does is there's another tattoo. He sees a tattoo, then there's another tattoo. So that's a trigger to get him to look at his tattoos. Because it will just says fact number 1 or whatever it is, and then he begins to look at his tattoos. And that's the process he goes through. So he's already conditioning himself to remember Sammy Jenkins. And he says in the black and white scenes that gives him purpose to be more, or it's a cautionary tale, right? For him to be more organized than Sammy Jenkins, to be more on top of it than Sammy Jenkins was. But he's really learning from his own mistakes. It's pretty interesting. But the reason why I bring that up is this. Even when we go through the timelines, him conditioning himself to remember things is very important, okay? It's a big part of this movie. And you don't want to, like anything in any interpretive endeavor, you don't want to say, well, this one thing is everything. You want to be enough open-minded to say, well, there are other elements to consider. But this is a pretty big thing. I had the coffee out this time because I'm going to need to have something to drink on here for a bit. Three timelines to consider. A lot of people don't realize that. Anytime you mess with time in a movie, you automatically have to deal with the audience's time, okay? So when Nolan, in the special features on the DVD, he described, and it's on YouTube if you want to look it up, he describes the timeline as a hairpin, okay? And what does he mean by that? Well, you have the color scenes going in reverse, right? In reverse. And then it circles around to the black and white scenes, which were going forward. And the movie meets right in the middle. But he didn't draw the audience's timeline. But if you really want to fully understand what he was talking about, you have an audience timeline and just run it right through the middle of the hairpin. And that goes in a direction. And then you can see what reverse is and what forward is. And it's ping-ponging at various degrees and cadences between these two other timelines that the audience is taking in as they go forward, okay? It's an incredible idea for a film. In fact, he's never topped it. Even Inception, which is pretty unique timeline-wise, where the dream within a dream with, various timelines is still not as unique as this. I think because this is a little more plain, and so he did more with it. It's just so interesting. All right, anyway. So the color timeline, who is the narrator and what's the motivation of the narrator for the color timeline? Well, the narrator is Leonard. And you may go, well, there was no narrator for the color timeline. Well, that's true. But there is narration in a way. And the narration is Leonard's inner dialogue. And his inner dialogue is in real time, okay? He's analyzing every subjective situation as they occur. It's existentials. Every moment he lives out, he's reacting to in his mind. Now, if you don't believe me, just think to a few scenes, right? Maybe I'm chasing this guy. Or no, maybe he's chasing me, right? When he's talking to himself, Elaine and both Natalie, he's like, how do I heal if I can't experience time? Really interesting questions. And so it's not just that he's an unreliable narrator per se. It's why is he an unreliable narrator? Well, in this particular case, in the color scenes, he's an unreliable narrator because he doesn't know what's going on. You see, he has no idea. And yet we're hearing narration. Well, what you as an audience member, when you hear a narrator, what do you think? They're telling you what's going on. But in the black and white scenes, who's he narrating to? Well, that's a good question because he's not narrating to the audience. He is telling the story that he remembers every time he looks at his hand. When he looks at his hand, that's what's going on in his mind, is what you're seeing in the black and white scenes. He remembers Sammy Jenkins. But who's he talking to? Well, he's talking on the phone. Right smack in the middle of the narration there, he opens takes a thing and sees a text that says never answer the phone. Well, that would have been the end of the narration in those scenes. The movie wants you to believe that Teddy is who he's talking to on the phone, but that is not lock, stock, and barrel. It is quite possible he's actually talking to Jimmy Grant's. How do I know this? Because when he's pulling Jimmy Grant's body into the basement at the very end, he hears Grant say, Sammy. It's a really good scene. And he's like, how does he know who Sammy Jenkins is? Like, I wouldn't tell him about Sammy. So it's really interesting, who, like how does he know who Sammy? And the only conclusion I can come to is he was talking to him on the phone. There could be something off screen that happened we're not aware of, but it's just so interesting. Okay. Now, so Leonard, in the color timeline, is trying to heal. Okay, now we have to ask a question real quick. Let's go into the weeds a bit more about who is Sammy Jenkins? Who is he? Who is this guy? I mean, how much of Sammy Jenkins is Leonard, and how much of Leonard is Sammy Jenkins? Well, by Leonard's definition, okay, if we look at the color timeline and we go by the black and white timeline as well, Leonard's definition of Sammy Jenkins is he was this guy who got in a car accident, and he got in this car accident and he got this condition, and they were skeptical. It turned out to be legit, but he found out through testing that it was merely psychological, not physical. That's all they needed for him not to give him the insurance claims. Sammy's wife comes to him and says, I want you to, have a heart for 30 seconds and tell me if my husband's faking. She goes, I see my old Sammy. And he says, I think he should be able to physically make new memories. Now, if that is actually Leonard's wife, she couldn't be talking to Leonard. So we already have a bit of a question mark about how much of Leonard is Sammy. And I'll get into that in a minute. And so his wife gives him she tests him, right? She's testing Sammy, and he fails the final test by giving her an overdose of insulin. Now, who does Teddy say? Who does Teddy say that Sammy Jenkins is? Well, Teddy says he's a faker. He was a con man. Didn't even have a family. And Leonard busted him. So what ended up happening here is Sammy, then Leonard gets the condition. So now we're left with, okay, since none of that is Sammy, he didn't even have a family, and we see Leonard in the hospital instead of Sammy at some point. We see Leonard did not pinch his wife on the thigh. She was giving her an insulin shot. What we end up with Leonard is that he might be Sammy, but some of that isn't possible. Like I said, his wife can't go talk to him to fix the problem. So not all of what we learn about Sammy can be Leonard. Some of that is stuff made up by Leonard. Now you might go, well, that's kind of strange, but think about it. The end of the movie, when one of the pictures fades into, one of the Polaroids fades into, into the picture that's to be, it goes from being black and white to color. So what he's showing you is that both timelines have merged now. You're in the middle of the timeline at the very end of the movie. And now you're learning from Teddy what the objective perspective on this. Now, objective doesn't mean true. The black and white scenes are objective, but objective doesn't mean true. It's about motive, right? His motive in the black and white scenes are to narrate, and tell this story. The color scenes are his moment by moment experience, so those are subjective, okay? And Nolan's very clear about this, so I don't have to worry about anyone arguing with those points. But when you get to the end, you have a blending of the two. So what's that mean? Well, it might mean we're getting Teddy's perspective, which is what happens. Teddy starts narrating what happened. Yeah, he saw the real John G. Your wife surviving the accident. Now, which is clear. His wife survived, not the accident, the attack. His wife clearly survived the attack. The movie itself makes this clear. So that leads us to the next question, as we're getting to the end here. What was Leonard's experience? If we can maximize, not that we have to, but if we can maximize how much of Leonard is Sammy Jenkins, then how can we understand Leonard's experience at that point? Well, here's what would have happened. In the movie, I think, as I figured this out and watched the movie again, it just all unlocked for me. It was so interesting. His daily experience would have been this. He would have woken up, he would have thought his wife had died on the bathroom floor, and he would have experienced that his wife was alive. He would have, throughout the day, thought she was dead and then found her alive. It's not something that's really overt in the film, but it does address it, and we'll talk about that. So he does this. This happens to him every day. Again, attempting to maximize, it appears that she tested Leonard. She wanted her old Leonard back, not her old Sammy back, even though that conversation could not have happened because Leonard can't be two places at once. But it still looks like she did test him with insulin because it shows him giving her an insulin shot. And it appears that she died from insulin. It may also be the case that he started his investigation before she even died. It's possible. I don't know. Because Teddy still could have felt sorry for him, you know? So anyway, and what I mean by that is, and then helped him with his investigation. Teddy's motives at first, by the way, were altruistic. He really wanted to help him, apparently. But then after that, he tells him, you know, he uses Leonard. That's okay, because Leonard's using himself, you know. But anyway, so that would have been his daily experience. And at some point after the insulin, his wife, Leonard, probably ended up in a home for a bit of time. But it's the opposite of what he said about Sammy Jenkins. What he said about Sammy Jenkins when he was in a home was he didn't even know his wife was dead. For Leonard, it's the opposite. Now she's never there, so she's just dead in his mind. All right, so again, how much of those images and everything can you trust? We don't know, right? It's a little bit subjective, so it's hard to tell. Maybe subjective is the wrong word, but you just can't quite entirely tell. Okay, so that would have been his daily experience. Now, in the movie in color kind of confirms some of this. So he's talking to Bert at the front office, very beginning of the movie, and Bert goes, "What's it like?" And Leonard looks down and he goes, "It's like waking up." When he said that, I was like, interesting. And you'll remember this if you've watched the movie like I have. You'll see scenes where he says this. He goes, he's sleeping. He goes, "Awake," you know? And he'll show a guy with a mask on. He'll say, "Awake." Or he'll see his wife, you know, behind the plastic. And he's laying with Natalie and he says, "How can I heal if I cannot experience time?" And then at some point, it's really interesting. At some point, sorry, I had an alarm go off there. He says, he's talking to Natalie, he says, "If I could reach over and feel that the bed was cold, then I would know you were gone." And this helps us understand the scenes with the prostitute. He hires a prostitute and he says, "Lay this stuff around like it's yours." And he says, "When I fall asleep, go into the bathroom and slam the door loud enough that it wakes me up." And he wakes up and feels over, but that bed has to be warm, right? Not cold. What's going on here? Didn't he just tell Natalie that if he could wake up and feel that the bed was cold, he could move on with his life? "I would know that you're gone." Why is he saying that? To condition himself. He wants to reach over every day and see that the bed is cold. There may also be a little bit of just, this isn't probably the right word, but maybe allegory going on, where if he could just condition himself to believe that his wife is gone, he would heal. And he might be right, because this could only be psychological anyway. Because after all, what was Sammy's wife trying to do? Get him to pop out of it. That's what she says. If I could just get him to snap out. So she didn't know what to believe, whether he was lying, faking, or whether he was in a psychological state that she could get him out of. And that might be where Leonard is too. And that apparently is what Leonard's wife thought also, possibly. So Leonard is going to condition himself to get out of that position. But instead, he hires a prostitute so that he could experience the bed being warm. What is that telling us? Well, it's maybe foreshadowing that Leonard's lying to himself, which is true. We do know that. So that leads us to the very, very end of the movie, because there are some people who've watched this movie enough that have noticed something. They've noticed at the very end of the movie, you see Leonard laying with his wife, and his wife takes her hand and takes it down his chest, and he's got a tattoo that says, I did it. You're very astute if you caught that. I didn't catch it for years. I didn't catch all kinds of things for years because I was so focused on something else every single time I watched it. I'm a slow learner. Oh, I'm not even joking. I really am. The way I learn, it's weird. I feel like I don't know anything, and all of a sudden it's just there, you know. But I have some arguments for what I think about this, but I think there's no way. I don't think there's any way to say that this scene that Leonard sees is real. And this brings me, you know how the black and white and the color merge? All right, this brings my bonus theory and my Leonard psychological condition theory together and merges. All right, so just like in Memento, two things are merging here. My bonus theory is that there's a specific memento. And that specific memento is represented, it's meant to represent his emergence from the subjective into the objective. He says early in the movie, he's talking to Natalie in the restaurant, and he says, I have to believe there's a world outside of myself, that my memories don't matter, my personal experience doesn't matter, there's something real outside of me. And he says this at the very end. He's driving, he closes his eyes, bad idea, and he sees a vision. And the vision is of his wife and the tattoo that says, I did it. That might be the memento that the movie's titled after. I'm not sure. There could be other key mementos that you could bring up and say, well, that makes more sense. But this is what I think it might be. Not that there needs to be a memento. It might just be a clever title, but something to think about. But here's the thing. That vision has got to be a fantasy. I don't believe there's any... First, and I have several arguments for this. Okay, the first is this. I believe it's a fantasy because of the timeline. And I think this is the best argument against that being an actual image of him and his wife, a narration about him and his wife finally coming together. In fact, I think it's not even about his ex-wife. It's about him transcending the subjective into the objective. That's what that scene really is. Remember, the timeline's a hairpin, right? And we're meeting right here where the hairpin curves. So for him to have that tattoo there would have been after his wife's death. Think about that for a minute. Now you might say, well, if you believe that his wife lived, right, then, but that image takes place in the middle of the story. So in the middle of the timeline. So he wouldn't have been able to, now you might say, well, it's narration pointing to, ultimately to his wife, that Christopher Nolan is saying something to us. I don't think so. It's in color. Why is that important? Because he's driving, he closes his eyes and he says, is there a world out there? I have to believe there's a world outside of my experience. Is there a world out there? And I'm just like everyone else, is what he says. And so that would seem to suggest that him conditioning himself to believe that his wife is alive lends itself to that. Okay, so I spent a little more time on that than I meant to. So the other thing, this is really interesting. Notice something strange about that tattoo. It's right side up. His tattoos are all designed for him to read by looking in the mirror, looking down. I think you can there might be an exception or two, but generally that's what they are. And this tattoo that says, I did it, seems to be there so that he can read it in his mind. It might be there so the audience can read it. That's a potential argument as well. But it's in color, right? And then finally, he's an unreliable narrator who's willing to lie to himself. And this is an image he's seeing in his head, possibly, which would mean that he's lying to himself. He's not reliable. You can't go to him to learn any facts. So saying this is the end of this is what happens beyond the movie as he goes back to his wife doesn't seem to entirely hold water, because this is in his head. Why does it show this image after he closes his eyes and postulates about the objective, right? About a world outside of himself. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so that's how we end up understand. So my conclusion, here it is, finally. After everything I'm saying this. If we maximize as much as it can be without contradiction, how much of Sammy Jankus is Leonard and how much of Leonard's wife is Sammy Jankus's wife, we end up with the conclusion that although Sammy got busted for lying when he was holding the objects, and they concluded that his condition was psychological, he messed it up because he was a fraud. But Leonard may have gone through the same test, but had a psychological condition and also could have failed the test, but ended up with a psychological condition. And so therefore his condition may not be physical, but psychological. Number two, Leonard, the title Memento might actually be referring to either that tattoo we see in his fantasy about his wife, or that process of transitioning from the subjective into the objective, which might also be allegorical for healing. You know what I mean? Arriving at a new identity, one that's stable. Anyway, if you listen to all this, I am impressed. This is really here mainly for posterity, for just getting my thoughts out there, because I just love this movie. I think it's the greatest movie ever made. I'll end with this. I watched Vertigo. Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. It finally got, it triumphed over, there's some committee that decides what the greatest movie of all time is. I don't know what it's called. It's the same people decided that Pluto isn't a planet. I don't know. They said forever that Citizen Kane was the greatest movie ever made. And about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer now, they said Vertigo was the greatest movie ever made. I saw Citizen Kane. I was bored out of my skull. And so I saw Vertigo, and I really liked it in certain parts. It was boring, but certain parts were really good until you got to the end. And I told you, I'm not picky about endings, but man, it was far-fetched. These people would have had to fully understand the Human Genome Project to be able to program a guy with vertigo to do the things he did. They really literally would have had to program this guy. And I just think the ending is really far-fetched. Watch it. You'll see. It's a terrible ending. It's actually really bad, in my opinion. And again, I'm not even picky about it. Memento's ending isn't that great when you really think about it. In terms of satisfactory payoff and all that, it's like, yeah, I like it as far as for analysis, but it's not the greatest ending, which is great. At least look, that's fine with me. It's a subjective ending. It's fine. That's great. I'd rather have that than some solid thing like what Vertigo does. It does the opposite of Vertigo. I believe It's just my opinion. Okay, older people will get really fired up about this maybe, but I think that Memento. I really feel Alfred Hitchcock would have at least loved Memento, and may have. He seemed like a pretty honest guy. I think he would have had to say that Memento was probably a movie he would have loved to have made, because it does it all. It does it so good, man. Anyway, if you gave me this much of your time, even just listening to me, thank you. Really, I really do appreciate it. And if you're someone just years down the road that loves Memento, um, get a hold of me. Give me a message under here, because I love to talk to people. And even if you radically disagree with me, that's fine. I want to hear an alternative theory. I don't want to go and search them on message boards, but if someone wants to interact, I would love that. So anyway, have a good one and watch Memento. You will not be a waste of your time.